Oh my god, chat, is this it? Is this it? I have been wanting to talk about this for a little bit, and it has been in my backlog for a while, which is basically looking at the evolution of Prydwen's tier list. For this specific example, is gonna be their Memory of Chaos tier list, all the way from version 1.0 through to the current update, which is going to be version 3.2. Huge shout out to Mr. Quackson for compiling essentially what I'm assuming is going to be the accurate representation of the Memory of Chaos tier list. So without further ado, let's just take a look. Scylla, second half of 1.0. Alright, so the evolution essentially went from the transition of Himiko, Yanqing, Physical Trailblazer. They dropped down to B and C respectively. Japard actually went to tier S plus, chat. And then we have Fire Trailblazer dropping down from S plus to S, right? And Yanqing arised from tier A to tier S, being in the same category as his master Jingyuan. This is on release, where the buffs are meant to favor the rate up units. In case you guys forgot, I will never forget this, by the way. Right, the very first buff we've ever gotten was that if you were a hunt or an erudition unit, you gain an extra turn at the start of every single cycle. It also had ice weakness. There really is only just one guy that could pull this off, which is Yanqing, the Ice Elemental Hunt DPS, and every single Mach 10, not even Mach 12, Mach 10 players, they most likely would have involved Yanqing, especially if you didn't pull for any of the limiter, right? So, yep, very interesting update, very interesting update. Okay, first half of 1.1 saw Silver Wolf immediately coming into the S plus tier. Oh, so the first and second half of version 1.1, we had Silver Wolf and Luocha instantly jumping into the S plus tier category, and Himiko actually somehow managed to rise up half rank from B to A. I'm guessing towards the later portion of the video, they also managed to make the transition from the SSAB into the current tier list we know right now as tier 0, tier 0.5, etc, right? So I do feel that this positioning so far, it was pretty justified. We all know that on launch, Silver Wolf, she basically enabled a lot of different players to sort of bypass the very restrictive elemental archetypes in honkaistarrail, because if you didn't have any of the corresponding elements, you will have a much more difficult time. And back then, you know, if you didn't pull for Bailu, if you didn't pull for Japard, and even if you did pull for them, you will need that second sustain anyway for the end game. And Luocha is your guy, right? There are no other guys. He is basically that guy. We didn't have things like Gallagher. We didn't even have things like Lynx. So who else? Like Natasha? Probably, yep, it is what it is. So I think this too on launch, the rating was pretty fair. Jingyuan, keep in mind, I feel like personally the reason why it's not in S plus here, people were starting to become aware that no matter how much you want to bring up Jingyuan with your R-Star, with your Bronya, with your Tingyuan, Lightning Lord only goes once a turn. Right? Back in my days, there was no such thing as Sunday. There was no such thing as a crowd control resist like Fu Xuan. Huge update. With the introduction of Blade, he single-handedly pushed down almost everyone in the S category. Japard and Bailu goes down to be below Luocha, and the only ones still in S plus will be Bronya, Scylla, Silver Wolf, and Luocha, which are basically the 3 limited units. Jingyuan actually dropped down to A tier, below the first ever unit from 1.2, Blade. Damn. Whoa. Boom. Okay, so that was going to be the inclusion of a Blade and Kafka. And I do sort of remember when this was a thing, right? When Kafka was launched, there were also quite a good amount of discussion discussing the strength, right? Is Kafka stronger than Jingyuan? Is Jingyuan stronger than Kafka? And they were sort of kind of going back and forth, because at that specific point in time, I'm not sure if you guys remember, Kafka was my first ever zero cycle I ever did in my entire life. I think I did it with Bronya, R-Star, and Tingyun. Oh my god, chat, is this it? Is this it? My first ever zero cycle with a hyper carry Kafka. We didn't have things like Black Swan. We didn't have things like Ranmei. Hell, we didn't even have Babin and Huan Huan. I think it's kind of fair because the environment, by the time 1.2 rolled around, they were favoring Kafka specifically. I mean, it is not a coincidence that you were up against two decaying shadows. The first action is an imprison, the second action is an imprison, the third action is when they start charging up their stacks. And if you couldn't deal enough frequency of damage, they are gonna let go of the stacks and they're gonna imprison again. We didn't really have a good amount of means to mitigate these high amounts of crowd control enemies, especially going towards the end game, right? So yeah, I think so far so good. So far so good. Okay. The inclusion of 1.3. The launch of Imbibitor, Lune, and Fuxuan, they basically changed everything. For the first time in 3 patches, Scylla actually fell into the S tier. Scylla and Blade in the same category, and then Fuxuan and Imbibitor on launch, they instantly propelled all the way up to S+. I do believe at this point, Fuxuan was and probably still is one of, if not the most comfortable sustains that players could have been getting, especially if you played in the early days of HonkaistarRail, because your options were so goddamn limited and there were really just very little reasons to just not pull for Fuxuan, because especially for players that did not have any of these standard 5-star sustains, Gallagher's introduction to Honkai, right? I think it is a very, very pivotal moment in terms of the entire sustain class, because Gallagher himself as a free unit, he still outputs the cleanse and the heals required and the skill point positivity to essentially tie up almost every single team that we play right now. But because he was not a thing back then, players really just didn't have too many options, especially if they wanted to get into the endgame content. And considering that Pure Vision and A-Bot, they were not even a thing, I think Fuxuan's value, especially in the early days, right, are crit values. I would say that the early games of HSR is when most players would definitely feel the lack of their gear quality for their crit DPS, because remember, there were also no such thing as Super Break. So crit DPS, they were the only option you had back then in order to deal damage, unless you played Kafka with Sambo. To a certain extent, I think those technically still were, unless you were a DOT main, everybody was just running crit. For Imbibitor Lune, when he launched, I think his damage was one of, if not the highest in the entire game, because at that point, using the number of skill points in that multiplier is very, very good, right? For the number of skill points you consume and how quickly you consume those skill points, his damage was basically the highest in terms of action value. Even though his skill points, they were technically, you know, not very friendly, but there were players that a lot of ways you could have done to mitigate his skill point consumption. For example, sometimes you just save his skill point. Sometimes you just don't use his enhanced basic at all. Sometimes you use 2, right? Level 2 instead of level 3. Or sometimes, if you do have access to Tingwin, which improves his ultimate rotation, which means that you always get these 2 skills every time, unless you play E2 Dale, which at that point, I think E2 Dale, it was like S+. Okay, in that case, I digress. Let's talk about one of, if not the most impactful version 1 DPS we've ever seen. And there it is. And there it is. It's so cute, right? So this is gonna be version 1.4, version 1.4, featuring Jingliu as well as Top S. I feel like this is sort of like a history lesson. Right, it's not like a history lesson, just see how HSR has changed. This is only for MOC, by the way, no pure view, whatever. Jingliu instantly came into the discussion of being the strongest version 1 DPS, because the things that most players, especially casual players, the things that they like the most, it was crit value. Very little people had good enough gears. Hell, back then, if you had like 80% crit rate, it was considered good enough, right? 80% crit rate, 150% crit damage. But oh my god, that's just so good. Not only do you need to farm gears, people won't even level 65 fast enough, right? They were still farming tracers, light cones, gold, everything else before they could even realistically touch gear. So everyone just had complete dog shit relics, and Jingliu was the solution to having dog shit relics for the majority of the player base, unless you were a whale, right? An instant free 50% crit rate, it basically drastically improved your damage floor for anybody that put for Jingle back then. There was no other DPS that could give you this huge amount of essentially 100 crit value, unless you put for Fusion, which then gave you 24 at 12% crit rate, but it was still not enough in an environment where the majority of the casual player base, they were still in like the growing stages, right? They were still hitting puberty. They probably haven't even hit puberty. I believe that Jingle on launch, it was justifiably S+. It was very, very justifiably S+, right? At the inclusion of Topaz into the S tier, you know what? It was before they released Runmate, right? Yeah, it was before they released Runmate. Runmate didn't come yet. So you were still essentially running hyper carry DPS for your crit DPS for the most part. You had your Bronya, you have your Tingyun, you have your Pella, and you have your, I guess, Silver Wolf, right? I think those were your main forms of support. And dual DPS team at this point of time, I would say that it was not a thing. I think there was a couple of players that was trying to make Topaz work as like a dual DPS, right? For example, dual DPS with Topaz plus Jingyuan, or dual DPS with Topaz plus Kerala, right? But the problem at this specific point right now is that we don't really have the glue that can tie both DPS together at the same time. Beauty. So this was the update of 1.5, introducing Huehue as the S+ tier sustain and Argenti as the A tier Memory of Chaos DPS unit, right? The main changes, it was basically Inhibitor Lune unfortunately got knocked out of the S+ category. Silver Wolf, Luocha, Fuxuan, Bronya, Jingliu, they were basically still maintaining the de facto position at S+, and Huehue instantly shot up to the S+ category. I feel that this placement for Huehue at this current point, it was very, very fair, right? Because this was the first time we see a mechanic which had team-wide energy regeneration, as well as on top of the fact that everybody could technically benefit from this attack buff, right? We didn't have super break, we didn't have like the additional damage, and nobody really knew what the extent of like synergy would be. For example, Acheron's ultimate tied to Slash Dreams, Fei Xiao's ultimate tied to your stacks from the Flying Warriors. The sustained pressure on the units, they were not that strong, right? So for example, right now if you follow the 3.2 right now, when sometimes her sustain, it gets a little bit iffy, right? You have a lot of focus fire, the damage is a lot higher, and the enemies, they last a lot longer. Whereas back in those days, the HP inflation, it didn't get to the point where the fight gets very, very dragged out, especially if you did not make use of the Memory of Chaos mechanics, right? Argenti on release, he placed in the A category. I actually can't really remember what was the Memory of Chaos boss that Argenti faced. Olumatron, Gatekeeper, and Argenti. Okay, I trust Sarah of the Lake, right? So Argenti came with Olumatron, Gatekeeper, and the Argenti boss himself. I would say the Argenti boss technically is synergized with Argenti himself, which honestly is a little bit ironic because Argenti's weakness is physical. But the problem was basically, I believe this was when Pure Vision released, right? Like, Argenti was released in the same time when Pure Vision was announced. Because I just can't see a world where they will release a limited 5-star DPS and instantly it goes to the A tier for Memory of Chaos. Bro's release, it also must be taking the fact that we also got introduced to the brand new endgame content called Pure Vision. And that's where Argenti was truly, truly shining, right? Very little actually even considered Himiko's viability in the Memory of Chaos back then. Right, we didn't have access to super rate Himiko. You can't really trigger the follow-up attacks that consistently, and the AoE, she was just not dealing enough damage, especially in an environment that we don't even have a proper hyper carry or like a dual DPS support. I don't think people were thinking of like even raising Himiko, not considering the fact that Pure Vision was going to be released in the next patch, right? Same thing for Baby Herda and all the other 4-stars. I did notice that Blade and Kafka, they eventually did get dropped down to the A category, but I believe that this is going to be a very short-lived moment because the very next unit is what changed everything. So this was the definitive patch of honkaistarrail in version 1. The release of arguably, not even arguably, the strongest support that we have ever seen, Runmei. She has witness break efficiency. She is our first ever dual DPS support with an aura that affected more than a single DPS. She had the buff side to her own turn, so you were no longer that concerned if your DPS was going to be that fast. She basically worked with every single DPS, right? If you wanted to slap Runmei into something, you could slap her into something. She worked with DOT, she worked with Jingliu, she worked with Scylla, she worked with Impermanent, she worked with Dr. Ratio and Dr. Ratio plus Topaz. She worked with your Jingyuan if you wanted to, right? Probably not the best, but especially if you wanted to try sustainless, almost every single 3+1 team comp, that third slot is almost certainly going to be Runmei. Luocha at this point unfortunately did drop down by a little bit, so did Huehue, and so did Silver Wolf. Okay, to be fair, fair, Tobes was highly overrated because people were using E1 S1 compared to what the discussion was. That's why they stayed as high as they did for so long. E2 S1. She was very niche and didn't perform. Rachel gave her a purpose. I don't think Rachel gave her a purpose, right? I think her purpose only came out in the memory zone meme. Because one of the weaknesses when you were running Rachel and Tobes was that if the guy didn't have fire weakness, you were just kind of cooked. You would have literally been better off just running defense down stacking with Pella. You just slap on Ranmei, slap on Prydwen, right? All these kind of stuff. Just to steal. Hyper carry Rachel literally did more than Rachel Tobes up until True Swarm. Not True Swarm, the memory zone meme. When the guy was weak to both fire and imaginary, then that's the first. I still remember that was the first time I saw, oh my god, Tobes and Rachel was like super good. This is probably the first disagreement I would have with the Memory of Chaos tier list, which is Tobes rise to S rank alongside with the, I believe the changes were dropping Silver Wolf, Luocha, and Huan down to S rank, then Tobes rose up from A to S, right? So I think the reason why I had this discussion with the council was essentially I thought that this was the patch where we are gonna be getting the memory zone meme, which came out the next patch, right? Because that was Panagony. Because I still remember to this day that Rachel and Tobes, they worked very well against that first boss because it was the first time we had both imaginary and fire weakness. And at this current point of time when people were saying, okay, Tobes rose up in value because Rachel gave her a purpose, Silver Wolf did the same thing. Silver Wolf gave him the debuffs. Silver Wolf gave him more defense now. Silver Wolf technically has an even higher damage amplification compared to a secondary DPS that honestly didn't do too much on her personal damage, especially if the enemy was off element. And this was one of the downsides into dual DPS, which I felt, because dual DPS back then, you didn't have a thing such as Bubbin, right? There was no attack frequency that could do additional damage. So the moment you're off element, you are almost certainly going to be better off running a hyper carry, focusing on that one single DPS, stack on the buffs and debuffs and just do as much damage as humanly possible, which you can probably see from a lot of the Dr. Ratio showcases back then, where players use like Pella, Tingyun, like literally like 4-star units, right, SR rarity units, to get exceptional results, even without the use of Tobes. There might be a case where Tobes rise in value over here. It was because Tobes was E1 S1. I think E1 S1 Tobes definitely offered the utility provider, because at E0 S0, she didn't even offer enough debuffs for Dr. Ratio. Silver Wolf literally gave Ratio the 100% effectiveness for his follow-up attacks, but not at E0 S0, right? So me personally, I think this will be my first disagreement. I'm actually not too sure why Huan dropped to S tier. I think this was also the moment where Gacha Smack crashed out. Like, oh my god, why did they watch Huan? Why was Huan down to the S tier, you know? I think this was also one of the reasons that I think that Huan should probably still be in S+. I don't think the enemies were hitting that hard yet, and I still feel that the energy value that she was providing, it was going to be at this point much more important compared to the calibers such as like Luocha, right? I do think that Bronya's time would probably start to decline going forward after this. After this is when we got introduced to Sparkle and Black Swan, right? It technically still worked. You still ran Bronya. I believe you still ran her with Jingliu. You still ran her with Scylla. I'm not too sure if we had enough skill point economy to funnel into Imbibitor Lunay. I think that if you ran him with Prydwen plus Ranmei, he probably still has enough skill points to cycle. Unless you run a 3+1, then I think Bronya would have enough skill points to cycle all of your Imbibitor Lunay. Jingyuan and Blade and Argenti, I think they are just not too talked about at this point, because they were focusing their attention on Jingliu, right? Because Jingliu just released last patch, she's performing very well. Ratio announced the free unit. They can't make Ratio a bad unit, right? So running Kafka as the enemy on weakness imaginary with 40% rest Kafka, unfortunately the lightning class DPS is just not going to be performing too good. So it is what it is, right? 2.0 going into Panagony. Damn. So this is going to be 2.0. The introduction of Giantess Black Swan above. I still remember Black Swan's massive tits. Yeah, Black Swan's introduction alongside Sparkle, which basically dethroned Bronya at this specific point, single-handedly bringing up Imbibitor Lunay from the ashes, and Kafka quite literally jumped up by a 2 entire tier into S+ alongside with Black Swan's introduction. So I believe that at this point is where we are going to be taking a look at the rise of DOT, right, chat? This was almost the golden age of DOT, right? This was when DOT was getting shielded extremely hard. If you had Black Swan, Kafka, Ranmei, Huan, it was like you were set. You were like set, right? You were absolutely unstoppable. Not only did they have buffs for the Memory of Chaos to cater towards DOT, they also have buffs in pure fiction. They have buffs in pure fiction catered to DOT. So at this current point of time, if you did in fact got the DOT R-type, you were like chilling. And then for the hyper carry enjoyers, this is the introduction of Sparkle, and as you guys have been playing the game for the past couple of months, I think she went to the retirement house. First launch of Sparkle came at a whopping S+ ranking, tying alongside with Runmei, single-handedly bringing Dio all the way up to the S+ category. So do you think this was justified on launch? Me personally, I am actually gonna say yes. I think Sparkle absolutely deserves S+, because in terms of crit DPS, especially at this caliber, you didn't have anyone else that could touch the damage output that was generated by both Jingliu and Prydwen, right? The problems of Sparkle running only 50% action value advance, it was not that felt yet, because you were still running units that were dealing enough damage to the point where you didn't really have to squeeze out every single action value to the point of, like, for example, Sunday and Bronya, right? So your units like Prydwen got a lot to benefit from. Your units like Jingliu, after you use your skill, you use your ultimate, guess what? Because you were using Bronya, when Jingliu goes into the extra turn, it's like, voila, the buff is gone, right? The buff is gone. Whereas for Sparkle, you could technically still squeeze out a little bit more damage if you suddenly had enough ultimate. That will still maintain the crit damage buff provided by Sparkle for the Jingliu ultimate application. Same thing could also be said for Sela. Suddenly, if Sela was to get enough energy, slam on an ultimate, trigger another resurgent, all those would still get the buff from Sparkle until the start of her next turn. And all these, you basically had no access unless you had your Bronya at E6, right? This is probably one of the healthiest that I would say that the meta has been, because you had a lot of options, right? If you wanted to run dual DPS, you could with Daughter Vision and Topaz. If you want to run DOT, you could with Kafka and Black Swan. If you want to run any of the crit DPS with Jingliu, Sparkle, Sela, Imperial, okay, not Sparkle, Jingliu, Sela, Imperial, Jingyuan, all of them, they were more or less viable. Even Blade had the ability to zero cycle, because, you know, if you guys have seen back in those days, right, we had a whole Blade with Sparkle plus Bronya. The infamous 175 speed Sparkle incident. Holy shit, that was a fun time, man. Even if DOT was getting shielded, right? For example, when Black Swan came out, you had the buffs of 12, but all your other DPS, they were still so strong that you could just do it regardless, even if that buff was not meant for them, or even if the enemy was not meant for them. Oh! Ladies and gentlemen, the beginning of the end. We were all very, very happy. Look at Sparkle twirling, right? Look at Sparkle twirling. Everybody was happy. We were chilling. Nobody was being like that upset with what's going on. I weep for the departed. Sun Jing-woo. The Sun Jing-woo of version 2 has arrived. Her introduction to Honkai Starbucks. She was so strong. It literally made every other DPS look like A rank hunters, bro. Or like even B rank hunters. So let's see what changed with this edition. At this point, there were no changes to any of the DPS class, like Jingliu, Dil, even Kafka, Scylla, Jingyuan, Topaz, Black Swan, Ratio, Blade. Every single DPS, they were still at this spot. It's not because that they still maintained their position. It's not because Jingliu was as strong or like in the same caliber as Acheron, but it was because we didn't see the enemy changing yet. I believe this is probably the final or the second last patch before the HP inflation. On Acheron's launch, right, the enemies were not even that difficult. They were not to the caliber where your version 1 DPSs, they were getting cooked, that you're doing like 10-20 cycles. It was to the point where Acheron didn't even care if you had her signature light cone, because the enemies themselves, the environment in which you use these different units, they were still not to that degree of difficulty, to the point where the inclusion of Acheron's damage scaling, it made it such that your other DPSs, they were clearing a lot slower. We didn't have things like Jiao Qiu. We didn't have things where your Acheron could generate so many stacks that you're casting ultimates every other turn, right? So I feel like with all things considered, we didn't have a testing ground yet to conclude which of these DPSs would eventually get outclassed by Acheron. So as you guys will see from the list just now, This was when Prydwen updated. They updated their tier list from S to the numerical order, which has led to every single DPS going down, and Acheron is the only tier 0 DPS. And we have also the introduction of Bubbin. I believe that none of the supports were tier 0 at this point of time, because I remember Prydwen saying, you know, they want to be a little bit more conservative. I think they are always a little bit more conservative before casting immediately into what they had, which I do like for Bubbin's placements. It was kind of fair, because the initial sentiments for a lot of players is that you run her with follow-up team. Not a lot of people were considering the value of the 300% action value advance. Nobody really considered her for running with a DOT, for hyper carry, for the 3+1 setup, you know, dual DPS, like literally like any of the dual DPS outside of you could technically still run Bubbin, but I think people haven't really explored out like what she was truly capable of. And to be fair, like 0 cycles or all these kind of like sustainers runs, they are always going to be considered as like a minority of the community, right? Because you can't really fix the energy uptime, especially if you didn't run her with Tingyun. People probably didn't know just how quickly she could cycle her ultimate, right? You're most likely gonna be running. Let's just say you ran Bubbin with, for example, your hyper carry, right? Let's just say you want to run Bubbin with hyper carry. You ran Bubbin with like a Bubbin Sparkle hyper carry and a sustain. Chances are you're most likely not getting enough energy for your Bubbin to activate the ultimate fast enough. Only when people was like, okay, you know what? Tingyun, Bubbin, slap on another support. Whatever that DPS is, doesn't matter. Tingyun don't buff that DPS anymore. Because Tingyun's entire purpose, right? The 4-star Tingyun, every single DPS that has came out up until this point, Tingyun is always the one buffing them, right? Tingyun always buffs the DPS. You never see Tingyun buffing like a Bronya, right? You never see Tingyun buffing a Runmei or like buffing a Fushun, alright? And Acheron, you literally don't even use Tingyun with Acheron, right? Only when you're like, oh shit, Tingyun fixes this energy problem, you get 100% outtime of the ultimate. And with enough like speed tunings and rotation, right? You basically had so much value generated from all these like triple, basically 300% action value advance. It was a very, very game-changing environment for pretty much any DPS outside of Break DPS. And at this point, we haven't even seen what's after Boot Hill yet. I would say that at this current juncture, at this Boot Hills edition, you are running Bro with probably most people running him with a Runmei, HMC, and then you run a sustain. But then eventually people were like, oh wait, you can just run him with a Bronya. Slam Bronya, give him as many turns as possible, and then you can just do like ridiculous amounts of damage. Sometimes you might not even run him with HMC. I think this is still pretty conservative. I do think that at this point when people realize, okay, Acheron just completely fucking bastard, they drop everyone down. I think that was pretty fair. I feel that DOT here was still okay, right? It was not that bad yet, especially since Bubbin's inclusion. People ran Bubbin with Kafka and Black Swan and Huan Huan. It was like, oh shit, this team was actually just hella chill, right? Sparkle was still really running with Imperial Rune. I think there were some people that were starting to run Imperial Rune with like Sparkle and Yukong, if I'm not mistaken. Yukong, Sparkle, Tingyun, and then they slapped off Yukong, slammed in Bronya. Then you had Bubbin. Then you could run like Bubbin, Tingyun, Dale, and Sparkle. Zilla unfortunately dropped all the way down to tier 1.5 at E0 S0. I can't really remember what was the enemy weakness. It's probably not Quantum, right? Oh, Kokoda Aventurine MOC 11, then Japard Kafka MOC 12. Savra was MOC 11. Okay, Savra was MOC 11. Bubbin, her potential was not fully utilized yet. And Boot Hill, I think a lot of people were skipping him because the unit after Boot Hill. Oh. What the hell? Oh, okay. This guy is funny. The patch after, because it was Bubbin Boot Hill, right? I think a lot of people skipped Boot Hill because Firefly, whether you like it or not, she was the most popular unit in HSR at the time of her release, right? Died for us against Memory Zone meme, became our girlfriend, spent her last $20,000 credits, and she came back from the dead and revived, and then for Her Majesty, all the animations, everything, everybody was like meta or not, everybody was like she was her. It's not to say that people were like greedy or stupid for skipping Boothill or not skipping Boothill. It was more so he was sandwiched between one of the most impactful support in the entirety of version 2, as well as one of, if not the most impactful super rate DPS in the entire version 2. This was, at this point, it was either Boothill or Firefly, and then Rabba came out in 2.6, right? And people didn't really know, like, what extent was the differences between, like, all of the different endgame content. But it was an undeniable truth that Firefly had a way higher budget than Boothill. Everything basically revolved around Firefly, and Boothill was, whether you like it or not, he was like the supporting cast. Super Rig at this point is probably the best they've ever been. You slam on HMC, you slam on Ramme, you slam Firefly, Rennie and Gallagher. This team it can set you for that entire period. It was also the introduction of the Super Rig shield for, I think, the almost entire version 2. Every single MOC boss, and I believe the APOC Shadows also came around this time. I can't really remember when APOC Shadows was announced. You basically had a use for Firefly in every single one of these modes because everybody ran this team, right? Highest usage rate team ever. It's easy to build. You can finally stop building crit. You can finally stop giving a damn about chasing the subset rolls. Just slam on one of the literal free unit HMC. All you needed was a Ramme. And they had a Ramme rerun with Firefly. And then Gallagher was a free 4-star. Slam this team in and boom. You are basically good to go. Which is also honestly a little bit reminiscent of Casper's, right? You slam in the Mimi. Trippy is basically the Ramme equivalent. And then the sustain, ironically or unironically, it's still Gallagher. You slam this team. Casper's will just clear essentially almost every single endgame for you at this point. And I don't think people were too upset that Firefly was tier 0 alongside Aircron. Because I think they were both in a different category. There was like the specialist category, so Firefly was there, and then Aircraft was here, and then they were just both like neck and neck, right? So yeah, and this was also the time where Ramme was the only tier 0 over Babin as well as all of the other units, because that team itself of Ramme was just that synergistic. So it is what it is. Whoa! Why the Yingli? Oh my god, why the Yingli? Monga's Jiao Qiu. Jade was so irrelevant, I completely forgot. Okay, I'm just gonna talk about Jade, Jiao Qiu, and Yingli all in the same patch, right? All in the same patch. Okay, I don't think anybody was like agreeing or like disagreeing that Jade was a tier 2 unit for Memory of Chaos. Especially at E0 S0. We didn't have our mod-based content. For that slot that you will run Jade in, almost certainly you're going to be getting better results with like literally anyone else. And I don't think it's fair to say that the E1 fixes a core part of the issue, which is maintaining that minimum 3 stacks. But outside of this, I think Jade at this point, she was a tier 0 in pure fiction, if I'm not wrong, right? Jade's release was based, she was like the pure fiction woman, right? And I think she has held her tier 0 position of pure fiction for like a very, very long time. So at this current point, also Jade was the first unit I skipped. Yep. Because I think around this time was, I'm not sure it was when Watering Waves came or something. Yeah, Jade was the first unit I skipped in HSR and I didn't get. And then Yingli was the second unit I skipped in HSR. I think between this period of time, it was either Wawa or Xenon Zone 0. And I saw taking a back seat in HSR for the period of time. It was Wawa. Oh shit, Wawa ruined Jade. Wawa ruined Jade and Yingli. And in fact, I was also sort of low-key, high-key considering on skipping Jiao Qiu because my orders got me the E6S by Icon, right? But kind of glad I didn't. But in any case though, Jade, I think a tier 3 for Memory Chaos was very, very good. Yingli and Jiao Qiu's inclusion in this list, they were both in tier 1. I think this was the first time ever, and it probably set the precedent. There was another video I wanted to react to, which is what happened to Aircron mains. Because if you take a look at the subreddit, almost every other day, you have people asking, do we need Jiao Qiu? 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 And that has been going on for like the past 6 months, right? So I feel like this probably partly attributed to the reason why this was. Because on launch, he was known as that guy that was, nothing too exceptional. At this point, Acheron without Jiao Qiu, she was still really, really strong. There was no such thing as a 2 million HP boss. Even without Jiao Qiu at this point of time, you are still getting good clears with Aircron. The damage scaling, it was not off the charts yet, right? They basically introduced a solution, which is Jiao Qiu fix or rather not fix, but drastically improved Acheron's stack generation. This was a solution to Acheron not having enough stacks. They introduced a solution being Jiao to a problem that did not exist yet, because the problem was you not dealing enough damage because of a lack of ultimates, and therefore you couldn't clear fast enough. This problem did not exist at this point. So for players that skip Jiao in this juncture because either he's a male, or you didn't care about your Acheron, or Acheron was E2S1, which a lot of people put for E2S1 Acheron, you're like, I'm just gonna run my Pella, I'm gonna run my Seal, I'll run whatever, and I just slam in the support, and then it's gonna be done. I think this is the in real time, you can see how if you were to sell a solution to a problem that did not exist, that solution is probably not going to be considered that much. Especially when you are literally ranking him in a tier list that is being tier 1. And he also, even though he could synergize with units like Argenti or Yingli because his ultimate damage and vulnerability, right? People didn't really care about that because you could just run Babin. Like for a hyper carry Argenti or a hyper carry Yingli, you ran in a Babin, you ran a Ting Yun, you run a Sustain Aura, they were still dealing exceptional damage because Jiao was not best in stock for them. And let's just be real, guys. You probably went all in for Firefly. A lot of people probably went all in for Firefly. You probably didn't pull Jade, right? Maybe Yingli picked your playstyle or didn't play your playstyle. But for all of the Firefly mains, especially for players that just joined HSR with Firefly, you probably pulled for Rame as well, right? Because Rame was like her, right? You had to have Rame, HMC, Slam Firefly. Because Firefly without Rame is a completely different unit, right? So because of all these situations, and since Acheron still didn't face the problem yet, it is what it is. And there it is. Holy shit! That's my wife right there. Alright, and there it is. My wife is finally here. My wife is finally here. Yep. And this is also marking the time where I had a 10 times, I shit you not, 10 times consecutive 50-50 wins. I have never had, this is still till this day, my luckiest pulls I've ever done in my entire life. 10 50-50 wins back-to-back on my account, on Zedion's account, consecutively all in, inclusive of Synergy Icon. I didn't lose a single one, right? And I got her E2, I think in less than 90 pulls, right? This, okay, that aside, Fei Xiao gets introduced, completely reshapes the landscape of the dynamic being the endgame and meta crit DPS. Because now, if you were an Acheron user, right? If you were an Acheron user, you probably had the option of 2 for that second team. Because Acheron didn't really care that much about Babin, or at least not that important anyways. You either went for the Firefly's break, which I'm guessing a lot of people probably did because, you know, it's Firefly, or you just went for the other crit DPS that was Fei Xiao. Especially if you really put for Babin, Fei Xiao, Babin, Heart March 7 was probably around this time as well, and you basically use her to just slam the ever-living Hule. Yep, Yingli also performed very, very well against Hule, which is why Yingli also went up to tier 0.5. Because this was when Hule was introduced, right? This was our Xianzhou arc, you know, we had a whole training day with March 7 and everything. So I think this introduction so far is still pretty okay. I'm not too sure if at this current juncture, people felt the need to use Jiao with Acheron yet. Oh, Jiao rises up. Jiao finally rises up, which I think tier 1 honestly is very, very low. For a guy that can increase Acheron's damage by that much, Jiao finally arrives tier 0.5. And then we have one more unit. Oh my god, Ling Sha at tier 0.5 are not just crazy, bro. I think the main considerations of why Ling Sha was in tier 0.5 was because she was a Gallagher side grade. I think that has been the most common content with regards to her placement. Because essentially she was a break sustain, and Gallagher was a break sustain. And you know what? They're not wrong. In terms of a sustain, they both were there to help you keep your team alive. And it was not like you desperately wanted Ling Sha because Gallagher was bad. There was not a lot of things to improve from because Gallagher was just that good in keeping your team alive, on top of dealing very, very good toughness bar damage. In that regard, I feel like pulling for Ling Sha in this specific slot, and if that was going to derive you from getting like your vertical investment in your DPS, right? For example, your support investments, right? Your DPS investments, especially if you are still lacking at DPS, I feel that she was to a certain extent a Gallagher side grade. But what people didn't expect, what if we just don't run her as a sustain? And here comes the introduction where we got one patch, I believe, right? Almost 1 or 2 patches before, we had the introduction to the Hyper Super Break Ling Sha, where she was the DPS, you ran a triple support all in, and Ling Sha, she basically doubled up. Like, she didn't double up as like a sustain, and like somebody that contributed to your damage as a support, she doubled up as a DPS that could sustain you at the same time. And the moment people realized that this was the case, it's like, holy shit, bro. Why did I even want to pull for any Braid DPS anymore? I'm just going to slam her in. And I think people haven't really realized the full utilization of this yet, because she still had a problem of implanting weakness. Which is why if you were to run Link Shot with the Firefly and all that kind of stuff, you still had to have that mechanic to break at the same time. Even though, for example, the puppet trio, they're already all with fire. So you could see like DPS Link Shot Showcase, where you just slam the out of the damage, and you could have just killed everyone, even though we don't have the mechanic that is witness implanted, which is gonna change very soon after this. Acheron is now in tier 0.5. I believe this was yeah, the monitor, right? Yeah, chat knows. The monitor. There was this image going around. I think it was Photoshop. Somebody literally punched a hole into their monitor because Acheron went to tier 0.5. I'm not sure if you guys can still find the image, but I'm pretty sure that was Photoshop. But yeah, eventually this was probably the patch where people were like, yep, if you didn't have Jiao, ooh. I did in fact realize that Reba on launch was tier 1. Me personally, tier 0.5 was a little bit more fair, right? I feel like every single time when they release a brand new DPS, Prydwen always tends to be a little bit more conservative. Because at this point, you must remember, this is E0 S0 Reba with no synergy icon, and we didn't have anything called Fugue last time. But that being said, the Memory of Chaos buff introduced us to a pseudo rate, which is Exo Toughness, which we now call the Cloud Flame Last or whatever, but it's basically Exo Toughness. So you basically have a built-in Fugue for any of your Braid teams. So essentially, we had this Exo Toughness, and yeah, she was eating real good. She was eating so good. In fact, I still remember this video. Pella replaced Ranmei, right? This was the triple puppet guy, where we basically replaced our Ranmei with a Pella, and we still ran a Gallagher sustain. This was how much damage Reba was doing, to the point where you are doing a 0 cycle at E0. Okay, granted this was S1, running this literal full force RT against Puppet Trio. Alright, I feel like at this point, the Reba damage at this, even without Ranmei, was doing so well against this Puppet Trio, which honestly, you know, Firefly also did very, very decently. And I believe this was also the same time where Gaja's Mac made the video comparison between Firefly and Reba on the second half against Hule. I think Gaja's Mac was one of the firm believers where Firefly is really, really bad and Reba was a lot better. I think part of it was definitely influenced by how Reba was like 2 whole tiers below Firefly. I think this was honestly a little bit too harsh. And I think the main reason for this is not really because of the lack of Fugue or not lack of Fugue, but it's mainly because of the alleged reliance of Reba on her signature light cone, right? Because if you didn't have a signature light cone at E0 S0, Firefly had a pretty decent alternative that was being the fall of an Aeon, and Reba didn't really have anything else that good, and the signature light cone 1 was just that strong, right? Oh, we are so back! Jingyuan bros! Hail the Church of Sunday! Hail the Church of Sunday! He single-handedly revived Imbibe the Lune to almost the same patch as Acheron. To almost the same... I'ma keep it a buck. Right? At this current point of time, if you pull for Jingyuan and you pull for a Sunday, compared to a guy that pulled for Acheron and didn't pull for Jiao, bro, Jingyuan did more damage. You can tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think you could. Right? Because Jingyuan was probably the guy that was like, he's just solo leveling, right? He's solo leveling, he's gaining aura, he's gaining XP. Like every other unit, you have been getting like indirect buffs in the form of these units. And Sunday was what basically it cemented the absolute power scaling that completely fixed Jingyuan's biggest issue, which was Line Lord only happening once per cycle. This guy completely solved his weakness. But here's the catch, right? Here's the difference, right? The difference was, when Jiao was introduced, Acheron didn't need him. Acheron didn't care about like if he had this tier 3 simp or like have these like supporters or like this guy chasing after Acheron, because Acheron was her, you know. Acheron was released with such a huge power spike that it literally didn't even matter on Jiao's launch. But Jingyuan is the different story, right? Jingyuan is he has been the underdog of like your DPS since his launch, by the way. Since 1.0, Jingyuan has never exceeded past Sela. Sometimes here and there he goes up, but he has never been in a state in which he came out to be the tier 0 DPS. I don't think I've ever seen Jingyuan in tier 0 in my entire life. So throughout his life of suffering from like hardship, of like getting bullied by this like other DPS and all that kind of stuff. And like he's like the guy that was like grown up and raised in a very unfortunate circumstance when Acheron had everything handed to her on a silver platter, right? She was like pub stomping everyone and their moms, and she didn't need nothing. She didn't need nothing, and Jingyuan was like living the life of misery, you know, why the landlord keep not getting out, you know, the top of the BN, and then the landlord has like 1 AV away from the cycle, right, and then he gets imprisoned. Like his entire life has been like getting bullied and like betrayed and like and Sunday changed that. So the moment Sunday came out, do you really think Jingyuan mains would be like, nah, I'm not gonna pull Sunday? Nah, hey chat, does Jingyuan need Sunday? Hey, does Jingyuan need Sunday? Nah, I don't think he needs Sunday, right? Hey, I got like Sparkle, right? Hey, I got like Topaz, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, I don't think we need Sunday. No, why? Because Jingyuan was already part of the problem in which he has never been that strong. And the moment Sunday came out, he's like, oh my God, I'm all in, right? Almost every single Jingyuan main, it will be unequivocally the universal truth that if you wanted to play Jingyuan to the utmost capability, you just pull for Sunday. The other side of the grass, right? Acheron. Because Jiao Qiu was released at a time where Acheron was still tier 0, she just didn't feel the need to appreciate units like Jiao Qiu, right? Acheron mains just didn't feel the need to like, okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm just gonna get Jiao Qiu, right? Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, it's whatever, right? Like, whether you have it or not doesn't really matter. So because Jiao Qiu, it was not in a situation where Acheron needed him, they just didn't give a damn. In fact, he came out at tier 1 while Acheron was at tier 0. I feel like it's very interesting to see like the dynamic of these two units because they're both lightning DPS, except that one is like she grew up like a rich kid, and Jingyuan is like the kid that was like, oh my God, he was like living on food stamps, or he was renting, he was like working his part-time job, where Acheron was like she had everything handed to her. And now, when times like these happen, if your Acheron didn't have Jiao Qiu, it would have been worse than the Jingyuan that gets Sunday. Oh my God, okay, wait. You can't just jump scare me like that. Right? Okay, so, yep, Fuke gets introduced after Sunday, instantly bring up Reba to tier 0.5 along the same tier as Boothill. I feel that Firefly this entire time, she was literally untouched. I feel like this also partly contributed to why right now, if you take a look at Prydwen now, I should not, just take a look at all of the tier list videos I've done with Prydwen. Every single tier list update, Firefly goes down here. She either goes down more in Pure Vision, which she was never that good in. She goes out in the Memory of Chaos. And then now she's like going down in Epoch Shadows, right? Because I think that for the longest time, Firefly has just been this untouchable tier 0 for like whatever reason it is. And she has been viewed as like a break DPS that was 1 tier above the other 2 break DPS. Whether or not it's because she's an anniversary unit, whether or not it's because she has like more marketing budget, whether or not she's gonna be the girlfriend, it didn't really matter because like what would a casual base think, right? If you take one look into a tier list, and if you tell me that Firefly, Boothill, Reba, they were all break DPS, I'm not gonna give a damn about like whether or not it's because they were better in some fields or the other. I'm just gonna take a look at one list. Okay, I only need 1 break DPS. Okay, Firefly is tier 0. I'm just gonna slam Firefly. Especially since you can only build 1 break team. You didn't have 2 Fuchs, you didn't have 2 Rameis, you only could build that 1 break team that basically all use more or less the same units, except for Boothill, which could theoretically use like Sunday or Bronya, but I digress, right? The fall from a Firefly's perspective is gonna be a lot harsher, because for the longest time, she has this ladder where she was better than the other break DPS. And I feel that at the end of the day, right, all 3 of them, they are really good in their own rights. It was never a point of time where Firefly just exclusively outperformed the other 2 break DPS for whatever reason that has been for ever since her launch, right? And even till this day, after Fuke came out, Reba couldn't even make it to tier 0. And Firefly being a E0 as unit, I think I mentioned this in my guides as well, she didn't gain to benefit a lot more from the actual toughness, or at least as much as both Boothill and Reba, because Reba gains more charge, Boothill gains more pocket treasure. Unless you were E2 Firefly, you couldn't really gain the extra attack anyways, and E2 Firefly has a countdown, right? Okay, 3.0. Holy shit, right? That is gonna be 3.0. Introduction of D Herda, absolutely destroying the tier list, comes flying, slamming in. Barbin, wait, Barbin finally goes to tier 0? Really? Oh, Barbin has been tier 0 for a while. Okay, that means it. Yeah, Diora comes slamming in, and I don't think it's to anyone's surprise. I'm quite shocked that I think this was where they revamped the tier list, if I'm not mistaken, right? They revamped the tier list such that they removed the specialist category and they changed to like a sub DPS. Mem came out tier 1. That's a little bit crazy, not gonna lie. Okay, looking back at this now, this looks a little bit crazy. I guess the only reason I can think of, right, is that people haven't really broke out from the HMC. right? They were still running the break teams, and I think people even considered skipping Fugue so that they can pull for like D-Herla and like all the other units. I feel like that's the only reason, right? And they just basically judged Mimi to be the same caliber at the HMC, and I don't think enough people actually tried her out to see how absolutely ridiculous a 50% true damage buff was. Okay, maybe at least for D-Herla and use it with a lot of energy, right? But I think that's the only rationale. I just don't see why this would be tier 1 on launch. She was just so good. This is nonsense, by the way. I feel like this is probably like the biggest nonsense out of everything in version 3. I think ever since this, I think all of the other version 3 ratings so far has been pretty accurate. But Aglaia, she was so strong. She literally had the best, because we are assuming the best team, right? We are not assuming if she has Sunday or not has Sunday. If we're not, bro, we're assuming that they are using the best teams. She out DPS everything. It's just because she lacked the damage per screenshot, and it's just because we got teased that Casual is coming out, right? Because when we saw Aglaia's drip marketing, people were like, oh shit, they also released the drip marketing for Tribi and Casual. We are gonna be getting another anniversary remembrance DPS, and therefore it is gonna be like way better than Aglaia, which I don't even think is a player base fault. You know why? Because the exact same shit happened for Akron. It is honestly not even a player base fault for thinking that Casual is gonna vastly outperform Aglaia, because Akron did the exact same thing. She was another crit DPS, and she completely obliterated version 1. And because of this, like, PTSD from Akron, and I feel like Akron honestly is like, she's like the root of a lot of problems in the tier list or like the meta, right? She was the reason why version 1 got cooked. She was the reason why HP inflation happened. She was the reason why like the whole Akron main is still like, do I need Jiaoqiu? Do I need Jiaoqiu? Do I need Jiaoqiu, right? A lot of these problems, it sort of always goes back to Akron. And because of this, now that Aglaia get launched in tier 0.5, it's like, oh my god, another anniversary unit, it's gonna literally do double of my Jingliu's damage. Why would I pull Aglaia? Why would I pull Aglaia? And you know, I call like the ingredients to be right. No, this is not a player base fault, man. It is not your fault as a player base to think that Casuarys would just straight up destroy Aglaia, right? This is because of bitches, right? Bitches like Akron influencing your past precedences on how a DPS is gonna shape the future, especially for an anniversary unit. And because of that, people are like, okay, you know what? I'm not gonna pull Aglaia. I don't even think people knew there was a global passive, right? It was just strictly that she was the animation for the anniversary unit. That okay, I'm going all in. She's the anniversary remembrance DPS. There's no world I'm pulling Aglaia, right? And a lot of content creators has been feeling that way. Me personally, I still pull, and I couldn't be happier with Aglaia's performance. She was, and still probably is till this day, one of the strongest, most hardest hitting version 3 DPS. Yippee! Yay! Oh! Okay, so this is the patch of 3.1, right? Tribi My Day. And at this point, every single version 3 is in tier 0. I think we have a couple of version 2 units, but they are not even DPSs, right? I mean, if you want to consider Lingsha a DPS, sure. So if you want to think about it, Lingsha is the only DPS that aged well, because she was still tier 0 by being a version 2 unit. I mean, she's not really even version 2. She's like the last banner of version 2 before version 3. But yeah, I think Tribi, I don't think we need to talk about it that much. Tier 0, de facto, boom. Alright, easy. My Day on launch, I think after My Day came out and people are a little bit more comfortable with using Aglaia in Memory of Chaos, it's like, okay, yeah, she's actually bastard with the best team comp. For My Day, I think when this guy launched, I'm quite surprised that Prydwen gave him a tier 0 instantly, but they didn't do the same for Aglaia. My Day at this point, you basically had to, not really had to, but like if you had a My Day without Tribi, the damage performance was a little bit sussy. My Day also got stuck between like Tribi, and in this case, Casual is coming out after My Day, right? But bro actually managed to show up instantly to tier 0. I'm just a little bit salty that Aglaia just never got this treatment, right? Oh my god. The tits. Okay, not the tits, but okay, let's go. Boom! Casuarys came out. Tier 0. And I think this is my final point that I want to talk about the evolution of honkaistarrail's tier list, right? I am honestly very glad that Casuarys is not giving us a situation like what Akron did to version 1. It was a bad move. And I think that was probably, like, if you ask me what was the worst move that honkaistarrail did as a game in the past 2 years, it was not Silver Wolf. It was not Global Passive. It was not, technically not directly HP inflation. It was, because HP inflation is a symptom of a problem, right? It's not a problem itself. HP inflation, everything that happened, it was because of Akron. Because Akron set the bar so high as a unit, it fundamentally ruined like how power scalings work. in between versions, especially in between versions. You are giving not only the player base in the present the HP inflation issue in our endgame content, you're also giving them like a PTSD that they will experience whenever an anniversary rolls around. In this case, Caceres. Because Caceres, even with or without the global passive, you cannot deny that the overall usage as a DPS, she still performs basically around the same ballpark as all of her version 3 colleagues, right? And I say this before as well, even though she doesn't synergize with Sunday that well, but if she actually did synergize with Sunday that well, she could be that tier 0, negative 0.5. Which means that all of the other version DPS, they can't keep up, right? And I think this decision overall generally it was good, but it's just that because of what Akron did to the power scaling of your endgame content, to the enemies, to the environment, it basically f***ed up players' perspective of like what it means to be a DPS in HSR, right? Since Akron was this strong, that to the point where she completely invalidated almost every other crit DPS, not only do you have an issue where you don't you look at all the DPS from a different perspective, right? You look at DPS from the perspective of, okay, are they gonna get power creep? Because technically Akron did that to my account, right? She did that to all of the version 1 DPS, and once again, I've never said the DPS never existed in power creep. And number 2, because she was so strong, she also indirectly introduced another problem, which is this whole Jiao Qiu thing that you can see from Akron mains, right? Because she was released in such a strong ass state, players won't even think about pulling for her best detox supports because she was just that strong. And they couldn't fathom how a unit that strong could need someone else. Akron never needed anyone, right? Technically, I mean, just step on your nihility. You never felt the need for Akron to pair with units like Jiao Qiu, which also ruined a player's perception of like even team building HSR. Because why would you even pull for these kind of vertical supports when that DPS itself is just going to be completely busted? Because of these two problems combined, you lead to the environment where the endgame content for HSR, it is what it is, right? The HP inflation, as well as you're now skipping supports because you could just pull for a DPS that was so strong that you didn't need any supports. Not really a talk about Caceres, but just more or less about like how this whole anniversary unit is. I think Caceres is very healthy. Global passive or not global passive, I think as a DPS fundamentally, her kit being in line with version 3's power level, I think that is very fair. If you want to say Caceres outperforms version 1 DPS, I mean like it's been like one year-ish. So I think that is okay. It's okay. And to a certain extent, even the version 1 DPS, we are seeing the buffs, right? We're seeing the buffs of like to your blades, your Kafka, your Jingdeo. So I do want to see what the buff is going to be happening going forward. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I think this has been a pretty interesting discussion for the past 1 hour and holy shit, 39 minutes. Our word of the day is going to be tier list. Join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord, join Twitter, all the best for the video. See you guys next time. Take care.